Well, welcome. Tonight is a special night because we get to finish wisdom literature. As we have started our study, we started, of course, with the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. We then went through the historical books of the Old Testament that brought us then, once we finished that, into the whole factor of the wisdom literature, the poetic books, we could call them, of the Old Testament. And so tonight is the final of the wisdom literature books that we'll look at, which means then we turn the page and progress then into the prophets once we finish with Song of Solomon tonight. And as you see in your handout, as you see on the slide, that is the book that we're dealing with tonight, dealing with the Song of Solomon. Now, you'll hear me say this probably several times this evening, in the fact that Song of Solomon is one of the most misunderstood books of the Old Testament, most misunderstood book of the Bible, because of its content and because of its poetic nature. And so I'm hoping that tonight, what we'll do is we'll perhaps clear a little bit of the fog. We won't have all the answers for you, of course, but we'll perhaps clear a little bit of the fog for you with regard to this interesting book. Interesting in many ways, but especially interesting in the factor of God's preservation of it for us, His people. And so let's begin by way of introduction by talking about this. The Song of Solomon is a book about the emotions of people. And this is really the first time in our study of the Old Testament that we come across this emphasis, because previous we've been talking about the historical issues of the nation, its floundering start, its progression, its successes, its defeats, and we see emotion throughout all of that, and we see the emotions of people throughout that. But when we talk about the Song of Solomon, we're really now intimately involved in the emotions of the people, basically two people that are talked about in this book. And in particular, we're talking about the emotion of love. Throughout the scriptures, when we talk about love, especially when we get into the New Testament, we talk about love being what? We talk about love being an action, right? Because of the way in which it is described for us in the scriptures. We don't usually talk a lot about the emotion of love. But Song of Solomon, you can't get away from it. It talks about the emotion of love. And that's perhaps why we find it intriguing, or perhaps why we find it surprising. But the Song of Solomon also is more than just a human love story. All right? It's a picture not only of love between two people, but meant to give us a earthly picture, shall we say, of the love that God has for His people. The love that God has for His people. Often when we again think about the love of God, we don't usually tie with it the emotions of that, right? We often think about the love of God from a more of a static perspective. Here, God helps us to understand there's emotion involved. God gets emotional about His people and about love for His people. And so this is why this book is, perhaps we could say, special for us. By way of outline for the Song of Solomon, it's very interesting, and it kind of is an outline that follows along with what our experiences are in the whole aspect of the experience of human love. The beginning part, which takes in the first 4 chapters, basically, it ends off at verse 1 of chapter 5. We talk about the beginning of love. The same thing with the Song of Solomon. It talks about the beginning of love. Of course, with the beginning of love, there are what we call the courtship days, right? And that's when we, quote-unquote, fall in love, right? And chapters 1 through to verse 5 of chapter 3 talk about the experience of the man and the woman falling in love. They're in their courtship days, which, of course, usually then leads to being united in love, talking about the wedding, right? And that time when the love comes to its, shall we say, its fullest expression, and its most public expression, right? Where we declare our love for our loved one before God and these witnesses, as often is said in a wedding ceremony. That takes us into chapter 3. and basically to the very beginning of chapter 5. That's the beginning of love. We often, in the whole aspect of love, the emotions of love between a man and a woman, this is what we would call the beginning, the falling in love and the wedding. But we know that that's not all there is, right? There is also the broadening of love, for we trust that that is what happens as the young couple who get married then progress into their lives together. There is a broadening of love, and that takes us through the rest of the book in the Song of Solomon. Of course, with the broadening of love, there are those times when there's struggles, right? There's struggles in that love as you broaden that relationship, as you build that relationship. There's some times when you struggle with all of that. Guess what? The two people that are talking about love in this book deal with the struggles of love as well in chapters 5, 6, and parts of 7. But of course, with the struggling comes the growing, right? And so the last couple of chapters of the book then talk about how love grows between these two. So if you think about the traditional or the normal way of a couple who fall in love, get married, and then broaden their love, that's kind of the outline of what we see in the Song of Solomon. All right? So as you take time to read it, again, only 8 chapters, so it's not a long book by any stretch of the imagination. But this outline I find helps me, okay, as I kind of have that outline beside me when I'm reading through the book, kind of helps me understand what time period of the love relationship we're in, right? As it's recorded for us. So that's the reason why we have the outline in this way this evening for the Song of Solomon. By way of background, as we usually do, let's talk about the title. Why do we call this the Song of Solomon? Well, basically because of the opening verse. The opening verse gives the title the Song of Songs. And if you were to take a look at that just quickly, what do we find? Verse 1, chapter 1, the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. Okay? And so this is where the title for the book comes from. And the Song of Songs, this is the Hebrew way of expressing the superlative, or when we're talking about the superlative, we're talking about that which is of its highest value, right? Or that which is of its most emphasis. And so this is the Hebrew way of talking about the superlative. This is not just a song. It's a song of songs, okay? This is how we talk about the superlatives in the English language. Good, better, best, right? Well, this is the same thing here, but it's in a Hebrew way now. Instead of just a song, we're talking about the Song of Songs. And so of Solomon's 1,005 songs, remember we saw that back in 1 Kings, this one was what we would call either his best or his most important. Okay? So that helps us understand the reason behind the title. The more common title that is assigned to this book is Song of Solomon. That's also based again on the first chapter, first verse. And sometimes you'll even find in your reading that the book is referred to as canticles. Okay? What canticles means is series of songs. Okay? So basically, what you have going here with the Song of Solomon is you have what we might call in the musical world an anthology, right? Where you have a set of songs that are all put together to tell a story, right? You have and the story is not told in just one song, but it's told in many songs. And what Solomon does is puts all of this together in an anthology, and you now have this, shall we say, this book of love songs that tells a story about young love as it begins and as it grows in the marriage relationship. Okay? Hence why you'll come across the word canticles in reference to this. So, have you ever come across the word canticles before in your reading, referring to the books? Okay, you'll find that sometimes when you're reading about the Song of Solomon.
Or is it just called Canticles or Canticles of Solomon?
No, canticles. Yeah, canticles. You usually just refer to as canticles. You'll find that more with Hebrew Bibles and things like that. You'll find canticles. Okay? Author, who wrote it? Well, the traditional view is that Solomon was the author. We take that, of course, from the first verse and the first chapter. But to do our research properly, right, we don't want to just take what it says in the first verse, but as we take a look at the internal characteristics of the book, the fact that Solomon would be the author is strongly supported, because when you take a look at what we know Solomon wrote in the Old Testament, you compare his style and his form of writing, and you compare that to the writing that we find in the Song of Solomon, we find a lot of similarities in the style and the form. And not to mention, of course, the name Solomon appears 7 times in the book. That's a good hint for us, right? That would stand to reason that, traditionally we're looking at the fact that Solomon was the author of this book and talking about his own experience of love. Now, this is interesting to consider because we know that Solomon was, for lack of a better term, popular with the ladies, shall we say, right? How many wives? Does anybody remember how many wives? 700 wives, 300 concubines, right? 1,000 women. And so he was, again, for lack of a better way of saying it, he was a man that knew the ladies. So isn't it interesting? Because of his reputation, why would he talk about love? Especially when it seems that he had a wandering eye, shall we say, some might say. This gives us a clue as to perhaps the date that this book was written, or that this anthology of Solomon's was written. We would say that Solomon probably wrote this book while he was still young, okay? Before he attained to the popularity they had. Now, understand again, the 700 wives, the 300 concubines, the majority of all of those relationships were simply for the factor of solidifying alliances between countries and tribes and so on. So, if I marry the king's daughter of this particular kingdom, then that kind of guarantees me that we're going to cooperate together rather than be fighting with each other. That was the majority of the reason for Solomon's marrying so often and having so many women. But that wasn't the only reason, but that was the majority of the reason for all that. So that's why we would say it. Solomon probably wrote this book while he was still young, before being drawn away from Jehovah by his 700 wives. If we were not going to take the time, but if we were to go to 1 Kings 11, that's what it shares with us. That why did Solomon come to the point of doing what he did, especially toward the end of his reign? It was because of what was happening with all of the wives that he had. They drew him away. In fact, they got him involved in idol worship. They had him build temples for their idols. He had them build high places of worship for their idols. And so Solomon started well, but he didn't end well. And what can we blame that on? Well, I'm not going to say it, but we're going to talk about the fact that, these 700 wives were involved in that trajectory that Solomon had. So, a suggested date for the writing of the Song of Solomon, assuming that he was pretty young when he was doing this and when he was writing this, was maybe around 965 BC, give or take a few years, of course. But around 965 was where we date this book. So, being young and in love, this is perhaps Solomon's first love, shall we say, or first significant love, or what have you. And that is preserved for us. Now, the form of the book, the form of the writing, it's a unified lyrical poem. And what we mean by that is that you have a series of stanzas or songs of varied lengths. And they're all put together, and as I said before, kind of an anthology, if we were to talk about it musically. All right? Telling a story from beginning to end using several songs to do that. The quickest example I can think of a musical anthology, if you remember Gordon Lightfoot's early days when he was writing songs, he talked about the Great Canadian Railway Trilogy, or wrote the song Great Canadian Railway Trilogy, and he wrote 3 songs that talked about the development of the Canadian Railway. He tells a story from the beginning to the end, and he uses 3 songs to do that. It's called an anthology or trilogy. Same idea here, the same form with regard to Song of Solomon. All right? So that kind of gives you an idea of what Solomon is doing here. The setting of the book, well, of course, because Solomon is the author, everything that's talked about here is revolving around Solomon. And just so that we're clear, we're talking about Solomon, the king of Israel, right? The son of David. But what's significant about this, of course, is Solomon is not only the son of David, but also the son of who? Who was the mom? You remember? Bathsheba, right? And so that's one of the significant things about Solomon as well, right? He was the son of Bathsheba, which was the woman that David lusted after. That wasn't the love child of David and Bathsheba, because the love child died, remember? But after David and Bathsheba come together to be married, and after David's sin was exposed and all the rest of that, Solomon was one of the offspring of that union. And that's the Solomon that we're talking about. Of course, we also, because we're talking about the Song of Solomon, we have to talk about a Shulamite woman. Now, this is the woman that he's in love with. All right? This is the woman that we hear from, that describes Solomon in all of the poetic ways that he does. And this is this Shulamite woman that Solomon describes in many different ways, right? Her teeth are like freshly shorn sheep, right? I'm not sure that's an appealing picture, but you know, it's all of these poetic forms or poetic ways in which they express not only their love for each other, but describing each other and what they like about their charms, right? Now, we don't know really who this Shulamite woman was, because she is never named other than the Shulamite woman. It appears only in chapter 6 and verse 13. Okay? And that's basically all that we know about her. And the reason why we would call her a Shulamite woman is because the reason why we call her that, this name Shulamite is probably derived from the place called Shunem. Okay? And Shunem was located a short distance north of Jezreel, just near the plain of Megiddo. I got a map here, but it's a little small. This is the area that we're talking about. Jezreel is right here, okay? And then Shunem is just a little north. And so if you take a look, again, you got the Mediterranean Sea here. You got the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, the Dead Sea. Jerusalem is down here, okay? So that kind of gives you an idea of the area that is being described and why we would call her the Shulamite woman. She was probably from this area. Now, there's also some other characters that are talked about in this book as well. Not just Solomon, not just the Shulamite woman, but also the daughters of Jerusalem. There are these ones as well. Again, the question is asked, okay, we know who Solomon is. We're not sure who the Shulamite woman is, other than this is what makes Solomon's heart beat, right? But what about these daughters of Jerusalem? Who are they? Where are they from? We really don't know. They're discussed in the book, but the identity of who these women are really is never revealed for us in the book. And so there's several ideas. They may have been companions of the bride, right? The Shulamite woman, maybe the attendants to the bride. Or it's possible that they were attendants in the king's palace that were assigned to care for the Shulamite woman and prepare her for not just the courtship, but also prepare her for the wedding and preparing her for life later on. Or they could have just been interested onlookers, right? You've seen this happen before, right? In the romances of people, no matter how famous or infamous they are, there's always a group that's following to see what's happening with the relationship, right? Maybe these are who the daughters of Jerusalem were. We really don't know who they are, but we know that they are part of this book because it's preserved for us in the writings. Now, here's where we get into some interesting things with regard to the Song of Solomon. Remember, this is a book of the Bible, okay? We're not just talking about any old little book. We're not talking about a Harlequin romance here, right? We're talking about the Bible. We're talking about the Word of God. Now, major question. Why would God be concerned about preserving this intimate description of love between a man and a woman? Why would God preserve that for us in His Word? What's the purpose behind God helping us understand the intimate details of Solomon and the Shulamite woman's love. I mean, really, as we would look at it, is not the romance of people really none of our business unless it's us who's involved in the romance, really? Is that not how we really deal with it? Are we really that concerned about Solomon and the Shulamite woman and how much descriptions they can have with regard to their love for one another? And as you get deeper into the book and as you get into the wedding night and all the rest of that and the descriptions of their love for each other and their love making for each other, sometimes you can get a red face just reading what's there in the Song of Solomon. So why is it there? Well, we've been dealing with that question for a lot of years, and there's been all kinds of what we call schools of interpretation. How do we interpret this book? Okay? There are several who would say, well, we need to look at it from the naturalistic sense, and we need to interpret the book from the naturalistic sense. By the naturalistic school of interpretation, this is what we're saying, that this is a human love story. It's a human love story of literary merit, and there is no typical or figurative meaning intended. It's just a book that records the love from beginning to end of their courtship, of their falling in love, their getting married, and their relationship as husband and wife. That's all the book is about. That's the naturalistic interpretation of looking at Song of Solomon. There are those that would say, though, no, there's got to be something more to this, all right? And so they would have what they call an allegorical interpretation, okay? And what they mean by that is that all that is talked about in the Song of Solomon is purely figurative. It's not based upon historical fact. It's an allegory intended to give us a deeper meaning and a deeper understanding about God and His love for His people. Okay, so there are some who would want to take a look at this and interpret this from the allegorical perspective. There's also those who want to take a look at this book and interpret it from what we call the typical perspective. Okay? And from the typical perspective, what they're saying is this. The book teaches by example. Okay? So it gives us an example through the story of human love based upon historical facts. The love of Solomon for the Shulamite woman. Okay? It's a teaching tool that God uses, okay, to teach us about the example of love from the godly perspective, but it is also written as a type. And what we mean by that is that we review these historical facts as figurative representations. Okay? So, as we see the love experience between Solomon and the Shulamite woman, it's a demonstration, an example, a type that shares with us, as you see this earthly representation of love, that is an example or a type of the love that God has for His people. Okay? Now, some will take a look at that and say, well, yeah, are we stretching the text? Are we putting more into it than what is really there? Well, it's possible, but I think one of the things that we have to consider is when you go to the New Testament, and especially when you get involved in the book of Ephesians, that Paul writes his letter to the Ephesians, and he writes about, specifically in verse 5, about the roles of marriage and the marriage relationship between the wife and the husband. Remember? And at the end of all this, when Paul talks about, there's the responsibility, the role and responsibilities of the wife in the relationship, here's the role and responsibilities of the husband in the relationship. And what does Paul do? He takes that earthly example of love, the institution of marriage which God created, and what does he do with it? He says, this is what the wife is to do because this is what the church is supposed to do in response to Jesus Christ. This is what the husband is supposed to do in the marriage relationship because this is how the husband represents what Jesus does for His people. In fact, when you get down to the end of the chapter, in chapter 5 of Ephesians, what does Paul say? We've been talking about marriage, I understand that, but really what I'm talking about is an earthly representation of Christ and His church. Well, here you have a typical interpretation. Paul does a typical interpretation between the physical relationship of a marriage and how it is an example or a type of what the relationship is to be like between Christ and his church. Well, if the Apostle Paul does that in the New Testament, I think that gives us merit to talk about the Song of Solomon from the same perspective. So in other words, what I'm doing is I'm tipping my hat as to which school of interpretation I would go to. All right? The naturalistic, yes, okay, but I don't think there's enough there. Allegorical, I'm not an allegorist. I have severe issues when we talk about the text from an allegorical perspective. Basically, from an allegorical perspective, you can convince the text is saying anything really that you want from the allegorical perspective. But from the typical perspective, I think we've hit on to something here where God uses a physical, historical, factual relationship and says, okay, here's a demonstration of what my love is like for you, my people. Okay? So, let's talk a little bit more about that. Let's talk about the typical teaching that we find here. From this perspective, we would say this, then, that Solomon is, of course, as we see in the book itself, Solomon is the bridegroom, right? And the Shulamite woman is the bride. Okay? Remember, the beginning of love, right? The courtship, the wedding, okay? Solomon's the groom, Shulamite woman is the bride, and all of that which comes together, okay? And with Solomon being the bridegroom and the Shulamite woman being the bride, there's three possible applications that the typical teaching may have intended. In other words, who or what does Solomon represent as the groom? Who or what does the Shulamite woman represent as the bride? Three basic ways of looking at it. Some will say what we're talking about here is that Israel is the bride, okay? And God is the bridegroom. So what we're talking about here is the love between God and his Old Testament people. Okay? There's others who would say, well, that's good, but we don't just live in the Old Testament times anymore. Remember, we live in New Testament times. The church is established. This is a hint or a precursor to the New Testament experience, where now it's the church who is the bride, okay, and Christ is the bridegroom. Okay? Talking about the love between Christ and his church. Well, who talked about that specifically? The Apostle Paul did that, okay? Especially in Ephesians. There's those who would say as well that the individual believer is the particular object of Christ's love, okay? So, from the typical teaching, Solomon represents the individual believer, right? And Christ again is the bridegroom. Okay? So a typical interpretation that attempts to help us understand what's happening here. Solomon, the Shulamite woman, we're saying, is a historical, literal fact. But God uses that to teach us the principles of what it means for his love between himself and his people. Okay? That's what we call the typical school of interpretation. With that, then, the Song of Solomon has some unique characteristics that are different from all of the other books of the Old Testament. As I said before, it is one of the most misunderstood books of the Bible. I remember, well, perhaps you remember in your younger days, in your Sunday school days, where we used to sing that little Sunday school song, His banner over me is love. I am his and he is mine. His banner over me is love, right? And we used to, I am my beloved, is my beloved is mine, his banner over me is love. That's directly from the Song of Solomon. Okay? You didn't know that before, did you? So what you were singing was excerpts from the Song of Solomon. Now, it was sung from the perspective that who is my beloved? Well, it's God who's my beloved, and I am his beloved as his child. But sometimes things are misunderstood. that we don't know well. Basically what we're talking about here, and what Song of Solomon relates for us here, is what we call the oriental expression of intimate love. We're talking about intimate love and its expression from the perspective of the Jewish mindset. Okay? We have to be careful with that. Why? Because that's a different perspective than from the North American mindset. Our North American concept of love and the relationship of love from the North American context not only is very broad, but it's not very deep. It's, as some people have said, it's a mile wide and an inch deep how we view love in a North American context. In the Oriental context, in the Mideastern context, in the Jewish context, we're talking about the expression of intimate love that is reserved for the relationship between a husband and a wife. It does not stray outside of that perspective. This is something that's reserved for marriage. It's not reserved just for two people who are in love. From the North American perspective, we talk about love, they don't have to be married and they're in love, right? But from this perspective, we're talking about that which is bound to the rigors of marriage itself. It would not be thought of as being love outside of the bounds of marriage. It would be thought of as something else. It would be thought of as either adultery or fornication, not love. So here's this I think is one of the reasons why this book is so misunderstood, because we come at it from such a broad perspective that we don't necessarily grasp the beauty of the intimacy of love within a marriage relationship. It's, again, the only book of the Bible where love between humans is the main plot and theme. We see love between human beings in other books of the Bible, especially the Old Testament, right? But that's not the major theme. It's a story within the major theme, or it's a story within the story, right? But no, Solomon is different in the fact that we're talking about the love between humans as being the main plot. That's the main theme. That's what this book is about. And in fact, as you read this book, you'll find only one direct reference to God in this book. Remember the other book that had no references to God? Esther. Yeah. There's only one reference to God in this entire book. We find it in chapter 8 and verse 6. This is the Shulamite talking to Solomon, and she says, "Set me as a seal upon your heart, as a seal upon your arm, for love is as strong as death, jealousy as cruel as the grave. Its flames are flames of fire, of a most vehement flame." All right? And that's the wrong verse. I'm not sure where that. I should have double checked that. But anyway, there is one direct reference to God in the book. There is no direct or specific reference to sin in this book. Okay? So in other words, the intimacy, here's the key for us here. The intimacy that is experienced between Solomon and the Shulamite woman, it's within the context again of marriage. There's no sinfulness to this relationship. This is a relationship that is pure and is right. Okay, and no direct reference or specific reference to sin. There is no specific or direct reference to the religious realm as such. We don't talk about going to church here. We don't talk about worshiping God a lot here. Okay? It's talking and they're concentrating on each other. It's just like you've seen it before. It's like two young people who are love. Who they got eyes for? Only themselves. Right? Yeah, it's the same kind of thing between Solomon and the Shulamite woman. It's interesting. No other Old Testament book is alluded to in this book. Right? There's no allusions to other parts of history or anything like that that's recorded for us in the Old Testament, like some of the other books do. In fact, what's interesting when you get into the New Testament and when you get into the life of Christ does not refer of the recorded words of Christ that we have in the Gospels. Not once does he allude to the Song of Solomon. Okay, and nor is the Song of Solomon quoted anywhere else in the New Testament. Okay, so it's kind of again, as we've said, this is a unique book. It is one that stands on its own, per se, and shares with us some interesting perspectives and truths with regard to what love is all about. Well, all right. So that's what we know so far about the book, the Song of Solomon, and that's the deepest we're going to go into detail here with regard to this book. Because remember, as we've been talking about this, we're not drilling down deep. We're kind of getting a grasp of what the content's about, so that as you take the opportunity to read it, it kind of helps you with some light switches of your own. But then again, let's talk about the so what question, right? As we said a little earlier, why would God preserve this book for us? Especially when it's talking about such intimate things that it does. Well, let's remember, the book was written especially to stir up feelings. And I think what we're dealing with here from a broader perspective is that, we're looking to stir up the feelings of God's people. I think this is more prevalent in our North American culture, or perhaps more closely to our British heritage, right? Where we still are pretty proud of the stiff upper lip kind of thing, right? In our interactions with people, where we hold our cards close to our chest. We don't share a lot of emotion or feeling with others unless we're really, really close to them, right? From the Mideastern, from the Jewish mindset, that's totally foreign. It's totally foreign. You talk to a Mideastern person, or you talk to people from the Mideast, and you'll find that they are a very open, emotional, passionate people. If you want to see that in its reality, just start talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You'll see emotion. You'll see passion. And sometimes that's exactly what we see in our news, right? We see such emotion, such passion, people throwing rocks at each other and shooting each other and doing all kinds of things. That's the culture. That's the context of the Mideastern people. They're an emotional people. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm saying that's just their characteristic, right? And so, hence, we get a bit of an understanding of what this book is about now, right? It's written to stir up the feelings of God's people. In our North American culture, we don't often talk about our feelings when we talk about our relationship with God, right? Because we are stoic and we are ones who want to keep our emotions to ourselves. But God is passionate God. We see this often in the Old Testament. The New Testament writers talk about the passion and the jealousness of God and for His people and His love for His people. We need to, I think, get a bit of a grasp of that in our culture, where we begin to experience, or we begin to understand, it's okay to be emotional about our relationship with God. It's okay to express emotion with regard to our relationship with God, because God expresses His emotion toward us. I mean, just in the last week or so, right, we were celebrating the fact that we not only Christ's death, but we're also talking about His resurrection. As you walk through again what's recorded for us in the Gospels, what do we see God doing as He goes through all of the things that He goes through for the sake of you and me in His death, burial, and resurrection? What do we see? We see the emotion of God. Praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, what do we see? We see the emotion of God. Where He's so emotional that the sweat that is dropping off His forehead is dropping like as if they were great drops of blood. That's how emotional He was getting. Do you think Christ was emotional when He was put on the cross? Absolutely. We have recorded for us, right? When Jesus is on the cross and He looks down upon His mother and John is standing beside Him. And what does Jesus care about? He cares about who's going to care for His mother. There's emotion. Right? And so this sense, this North American sense that we have of emotion is something that we only reserve for those who are very close to us, where we don't necessarily express emotion in our relationship with God. I think we need to take a look at that again. Because this book talks about emotion from beginning to the end. as a demonstration of God's love for his people. The book as well honors pure human love in marriage. This is what's beautiful about this book as well. In the day and age in which we live, and we live in a day and age whereby marriage is often looked upon now as something that is negative than positive, right? Lots of jokes about marriage, right? The old ball and chain kind of jokes and all the rest of that, and maybe that's all in good fun. But isn't it interesting that we live in a culture in a day and age now where marriage is no longer held as something that's sacred? It's something that is looked upon as, well, if you want to do that, I guess you can. I don't see any value in it personally, the person might say, right? Some will review, marriage is just a piece of paper. You've heard that phrase before, right? What the Song of Solomon does is gives us the perspective that God has always had, right from Genesis 2 when he instituted the whole relationship of marriage between a man and a wife, between a husband and a wife, between a man and a woman. This book preserves that honor. This book preserves the beauty that comes out of a relationship that is pure, and a relationship that honors the bounds which God has given with regard to how we practice intimacy as husband and wife. But the book also shows for us the Lord's love for Israel. It shows for us Christ's love for his church. It shows his love for each of us, right? How the bride in each case should return that love is also shown. And so if we're not, remember I said earlier, this is a book that's meant to stir feelings, right? We're not sure how we should express our feelings toward God, who has loved us so much that what has he done for us? He gave up his life for us and rose again from the dead for us. I mean, that's the supreme expression of love. Christ talked about it in his earthly ministry. No greater love is demonstrated than when a person lays down their life for another person. Right? How do I express my love to God? Well, I think the Song of Solomon can help us with that. Whereas we read through it, we look to see how does the Shulamite woman respond to Solomon. I think that gives us some hints and some examples of how we can express our love for God. How much does God love me? You've probably asked that question before in your own mind. How much does God love me? Well, if the factor of what Jesus did on the cross is not enough for us to know, read a little bit about what Solomon has to say about his love for the Shulamite woman. That begins to give us an idea into the depth, the intimacy that God has for us as people. And so what the Song of Solomon then does for us, even though it's a unique book, even though perhaps it's one of the most misunderstood books of the Old Testament, what this book does for us is shows us a side of God, I think, that we rarely talk about. We talk about what God does often, but I'm not sure we talk enough about who God demonstrates himself to be in this love relationship that he has for his people. Song of Solomon helps us revisit that. The book helps us to see the intimacy that God desires of his people. And perhaps what this reading can do for us then is take our relationship with God to that next level where it needs to go. Where we now experience a level of intimacy with him that is closer to what it is that he's always intended for our relationship to be with him. And so I encourage you, take a look at this book again. Take a look at it from the perspective of what it demonstrates about God's love for you and how you can respond to his love in kind. I think you might find that you'll view God in a way in which perhaps you have not viewed him before. And that can only help you grow in your relationship with him. Let's pray. Thanks again, Father, for your word. And even though at times we come across particular points in the scriptures that we find difficult to understand or wonder about, Father, we have to come back to the realization that what you are doing through this writing of yours is you are seeking to communicate yourself to us. Father, cause us to be ones to see again, even as we would read this book, that we would see again the depth of your love for us, but that we would not only see that, but that we would see how we can respond to that depth, that intimate love that you have for us. We thank you that you do love us the way you do. Cause us to be the type of bride that communicates and declares the love that we experience together as our God and we your people. We pray in Jesus' name.